In 1987, during the final years of the Cold War, a classified entry quietly entered the logs of the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, an entry so vague, so carefully worded, that even senior officers assumed it referred to a routine reconnaissance sweep. Team R-12 assigned to anomalous signal investigation, Northern Cascade region. High confidentiality required.
Yeah,
But what
they're
the
getting
official
stronger.
paperwork refused to describe
Command
was
is
already
denying
muttered in
everything.
the halls of Fort Lewis. Strange radio pulses detected deep inside an uninhabited forest zone where no communication infrastructure existed. A place locals avoided and old logging maps simply labeled Redline Gorge. It was an area known for two things: its unnatural silence and a history of missing people dating back then. At 0440 hours on October 11, 1987, 12 American soldiers, all from different specialized units, Rangers, recon scouts, SIGINT analysts, and one cryptologic linguist, assembled in a briefing room dimly lit by a single projector. They were told only that a Cold War-era Soviet transmitter may have been smuggled into the region, and that the signal's frequency matched patterns previously associated with espionage operations. Their mission: move in undetected, verify the origin of the pulses, extract equipment if found, and return before nightfall. What they weren't told was that two civilian contractors had vanished in the same area 3 weeks earlier, sent to investigate what they believed was a simple environmental interference glitch. Their helicopter had been found intact, its rotors still warm, but both men were gone. No tracks, no blood, no signs of struggle. The forest seemed to swallow them whole. For the R-12 team, classified warnings remained redacted behind black bars on their mission packets. Yet in the silence of that briefing room, they sensed that the officers withholding information knew more than they would ever say. Lieutenant Mason, the team leader, remembered looking at the faces of his men: Hawthorne, the comm marksman; Ruiz, the comms expert; Daniels, the medic; Peterson, the survivalist, and others whose names would later be erased from all official documents. None of them spoke, but each felt that haunting weight before a mission that doesn't quite add up. Their insertion was scheduled at 0630 via unmarked UH-60 Black Hawk. During the short flight, the pilots avoided eye contact, as if trained not to acknowledge the mission's existence. As they approached the ridge, Mason noticed the sudden shift in the air pressure. The way the forest canopy below seemed unnaturally dense, almost absorbing the early morning light. Birds vanished from the soundscape. The helicopter's engine echoed strangely, as if muffled by something unseen. The team fast roped down into a narrow clearing, the soil damp, the air colder than expected for early October. Immediately, Ruiz reported interference, an unusual static pulse hitting all comms frequencies simultaneously, repeating every 42 seconds. Not Soviet, not natural, something different. The deeper they moved, the more wrong everything felt. Trees twisted at odd angles, old-growth trunks scarred with deep grooves that didn't resemble axe marks or animal claws. Peterson, usually fearless, admitted it reminded him of old stories about places where compasses spin and sound travels the wrong way. Mason dismissed it as local superstition, but even he felt it: the weight, the pressure, the sense of being watched despite no visible movement among the trees. An hour into their trek, they discovered what looked like an abandoned campsite: 2 rusted folding chairs, a toppled equipment case, and a broken shoulder mic belonging to one of the missing contractors. There was no sign of bodies, no gear scattered by animals, just empty space, as if the men had stood up and stepped into thin air. Daniels pointed out that the leaves around the site were undisturbed, no footprints, no drag marks. Like they walked out without touching the ground, he muttered. The team logged the location and pushed forward. The pulses grew louder, hitting their radios even when powered off. At 0917, Hawthorne observed something through his scope, a faint shimmer between the trees, like heat distortion but vertically shaped, almost human height, flickering in and out. When he blinked, it was gone. He didn't report it. He didn't need to. The others had seen it too, though no one admitted it aloud. By the time they reached the waypoint marked on their maps, a small valley basin. The atmosphere felt wrong in a way no military training could prepare them for. Not dangerous, not hostile, just observed. The forest felt aware. And somewhere in that suffocating quiet, the team understood that their mission briefing had not prepared them for whatever lay hidden here. Their real assignment had nothing to do with Soviet transmitters. It was something older, something no one wanted to name. And in that moment, standing at the valley's edge, 12 American soldiers unknowingly crossed the threshold into a place from which no one had ever returned. The deeper the R-12 team advanced into the valley basin, the more their training seemed to lose meaning, replaced by an instinctive alertness none could explain. Lieutenant Mason ordered a wide perimeter sweep before establishing a temporary observation point, but even as the men dispersed, the forest seemed to distort their spacing. Daniels later described it, on the single partial audio recovered years later, as like the trees were moving when you weren't looking, squeezing us closer together. But the strangest detail wasn't the shifting vegetation, it was the silence. Absolute, flawless silence. No wind brushing foliage, no branches cracking under boots unless the wearer focused deliberately on each step. Even breathing felt muffled. When Ruiz attempted to recalibrate the team's encrypted long-range radio to punch through the interference, the equipment emitted a sharp metallic whine that forced him to drop it, clutching his ears. The signal pulses had changed. Now they carried a staggered rhythm, almost pattern-like, repeating in clusters of 3, pausing, then repeating again. It was foreign to him. Neither Soviet telemetry nor any spectrum signature used in known global intelligence operations. Peterson, the survivalist, checked his compass only to discover the needle spinning in slow, uneven circles, reversing direction each time the pulses grew stronger. "This place is wrong," he whispered, a sentence preserved clearly on the body cam footage later recovered. At 1,035 hours, Hawthorne spotted movement near the far tree line. A quick flicker, like a figure leaning out from behind a trunk then vanishing. He raised his rifle, signaled silently, and Mason ordered 2-man overwatch coverage. The squad froze, scanning in synchronized arcs, but whatever Hawthorne had seen did not reappear. As they advanced, the smell in the air changed, an earthy metallic scent, like wet iron mixed with old timber. It grew stronger near the center of the basin, where they found what appeared to be the remnants of a decades-old fence line, bent metal posts, wiring tangled and half-buried under moss. The fence enclosed nothing, just an empty patch of ground, yet the soil was disturbed in a circular formation, as if something enormous had once stood there and been uprooted cleanly, without debris or foundation. The team documented the site, snapped photos, and set up a temporary observation ring. But before they could begin a deeper search, Ruiz's backup radio, powered off, crackled to life and emitted a faint whisper. "Human. English. Male. Help still here, please still here." Mason grabbed the device, demanding the speaker identify himself, but the voice dissolved into static and then into that same eerie triple pulse rhythm. Daniels speculated it might belong to one of the missing contractors. Hawthorne suggested a stray CB signal carried over atmospheric drift. But Ruiz rejected both explanations. The voice had come through an unpowered device. Something was triggering it externally. At 1,120 hours, as the team attempted to reposition uphill for a better vantage point, Peterson halted abruptly. "Someone's been here recently," he said, pointing at a single boot print in the mud. "Regulation tread. U.S. military issue. Fresh." Mason compared it to Hawthorne's and Danielle's soles. It didn't match anyone on the team. More prints were discovered in a scattered trail, branching erratically as though whoever made them had been wandering without direction or fleeing. The prints eventually stopped near an old cedar tree with a hollowed trunk, wide enough for a man to crawl inside. Something glinted inside the darkness. Hawthorne lowered a chem light and discovered, wedged against the inner wall, a torn scrap of fabric, tan, moisture-resistant, standard contractor field jacket material. The edges were ripped, not cut, and the smell inside the hollow was sour and unnatural, like decayed earth mixed with electrical ozone. Mason ordered the team to pull back to regroup, but before they moved 10 feet, the triple pulse signal abruptly changed frequency. It slowed, deepened, and this time, it wasn't static or coded telemetry. It was breathing. Heavy, labored, digital but unmistakably human. The forest seemed to tighten its silence in response. Peterson unclipped his knife. Danielle's hand hovered near his med kit. Ruiz whispered that the breathing pattern matched neither Soviet signal modulation nor any known electronic scrambling technique. It wasn't being transmitted. It was being imitated. When they reached a slight rise overlooking the hollow, Mason ordered everyone to check formation. That was when Hawthorne said it, quiet, but clear enough to be caught on one body cam. "Count us." Mason frowned, confused, but complied. 11 men stood around him. He counted again. 11. But the team had 12. Daniels insisted Hawthorne must have missed someone in the trees, but Hawthorne shook his head. "I counted us when we dropped in. I always count. There were 12. There should still be 12. The team immediately performed a manual roll call. Every name answered. No one was missing. Yet the body cams would later reveal that in that moment, on a still frame near timestamp 11 hours 42 minutes and 16 seconds, one soldier stood at the edge of the group whose face was entirely obscured by shadow despite full daylight. No identification markers visible. No insignia. And his stance was slightly off, shoulders too stiff, arms too long. But in the moment, the team didn't notice him. They continued their roll call, and the shadowed figure responded in a voice perfectly matching one of the real soldiers. Mason, unaware, ordered them forward. They continued deeper into the basin, unknowingly accompanied by something that was not one of their own. The basin floor began to slope into uneven terrain, the ground softening under their boots as the soil deepened into a thick, dark loam. The air grew colder, not the crisp chill of mountain climate, but a dense, damp cold that clung to the skin and seemed to seep through fabric. Mason signaled the team into a staggered column, but no matter how they arranged themselves, the spacing never felt right. The forest seemed to close in, compressing their formation into a tight cluster. Ruiz tried once more to re-establish satellite contact using the portable sinker's unit, and for the first time since insertion, he received a faint carrier tone, too weak for a call, but strong enough to indicate a path of least interference. He rotated the antenna, tracking the signal's deviation. "It's coming from the northeast ridge," he said. "But it's not a broadcast, it's bouncing off something." The team changed course, moving toward higher elevation. The climb was slow. The ground trembled faintly beneath them, as though hollowed underneath, and several times Peterson warned that the soil felt unstable. But when Mason ordered them to probe the earth with a bayonet, the blade sank only a few inches before hitting solid ground. The terrain felt unstable without actually being fragile, another contradiction the forest seemed to produce effortlessly. At 1,214 hours, they reached a narrow ridge lined with jagged boulders that formed a natural choke point. They paused to rest, but before anyone could sit, Daniels pointed out a disturbing sight. Carved into the largest boulder was a crude symbol, 3 vertical lines intersected by a single horizontal stroke. Freshly carved. No moss in the grooves. No weathering. Peterson recognized the pattern, not as a military or survivalist code, but as something he'd seen scratched on an old log near the abandoned campsite earlier that morning. Except none of the men had mentioned seeing it twice. Hawthorne aimed his rifle past the ridge and immediately tensed. The valley on the far side was wrong. Not unusual, wrong. The trees were spaced perfectly evenly, every trunk aligned in unnaturally straight rows, like a plantation grid, but far too old, too thick, too untouched. No forest grew like that naturally. Mason raised his binoculars and scanned the far clearing. At first, nothing stood out. Then he saw it, a faint metallic structure half buried beneath vines and collapsed branches. Square frame, rusted edges, a tower segment, a repeater station, but why in a region with no recorded military installations? They descended cautiously, weapons raised. As they approached the structure, the air pressure around them shifted, the silence broken only by a low-frequency hum that grew stronger with each step. At 1,240 hours, Ruiz identified the source, a crude communications mast, no more than 12 feet tall, constructed from mismatched materials, some military-grade, others improvised. Every piece was rusted except one, a small black box wired into the center, pulsing faintly with a red light. UHF relay, Ruiz muttered. But homemade. Not Soviet, not ours. Daniel suggested it could have been built by the contractors before they disappeared, but Ruiz shook his head. This wiring's wrong. Improvised, but intentionally wrong. Like it's meant to mimic real equipment without actually functioning. Hawthorne maintained overwatch while the others examined the device. That was when he whispered, "Lieutenant, movement, 3 o'clock." The team froze. Between two trees, about 30 yards away, stood a figure watching them. Human-shaped. Still. Too still. It wore fatigues, American. Old pattern. Pre-70s. The fabric hung loosely, almost floating. Mason called out a challenge phrase, military protocol for identifying friendlies. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even shift weight or breathe visibly. Its head angled slightly, like it was studying them without understanding. Mason raised his hand to signal, gradually backing away, but before he could finish the motion, the figure stepped behind a tree. Hawthorne blinked. The tree wasn't wide enough to conceal a full-grown man. Yet when they advanced to check, the space was empty. No footprints, no disturbed soil, no indication anyone had been there at all. Peterson whispered, "We need to leave this valley." Mason agreed, but then something unexpected happened. Ruiz's radio crackled again. This time, the voice wasn't pleading or whispering. It was calm, familiar. "Lieutenant Mason, stand by. Do not move. Rescue team en route." The team exchanged alarmed looks. That was Mason's own voice. Perfect pitch, perfect cadence, even the slight rasp he had when speaking through comms after long ascents. But Mason had not transmitted anything. Ruiz stared at the radio as if it were a venomous snake. "That's not playback. It's using your voice in real time." They immediately powered down all comms, removed batteries, and shielded devices in foil-lined pouches. But the voice continued, faint now, like an after-echo inside the valley itself. At 1,303 hours, the hum from the metal structure intensified. The red pulse on the black box brightened and slowed, sinking with a faint vibration in the ground. Peterson stepped back instinctively, muttering, "It's not transmitting, it's listening." Mason ordered everyone to fan out in a semicircle and keep rifles trained on the treeline. Every man reported visual anomalies, shimmers, movement, flickers in different directions. It felt coordinated, as if the forest itself was adjusting positions around them. Then Daniels made a horrifying observation. "Where's Larson?" The team spun in confusion. Larson, one of the quieter men, had been standing near the relay device minutes earlier. Now he was gone. No footsteps leading away. No snapped branches. No broken foliage. Just empty space where a fully equipped soldier had stood moments ago. Hawthorne swore loudly and did an emergency count. 11. Again. Mason barked Larson's name. No reply. Then faintly from behind them, directly behind, came Larson's voice. Clear. Calm. Too calm. "Lieutenant, I'm here." The team turned in unison. Larson stood at the edge of the grid-patterned trees, gear intact, expression blank. But something was wrong with the way he held his rifle. Arms too rigid, elbows too locked, posture amplified as if copying rather than moving organically. Daniel started toward him, but Mason grabbed his vest, whispering, "Don't." Hawthorne's finger tightened on the trigger. Ruiz silently mouthed, "That is not him." Larson tilted his head slowly, unnaturally slowly, studying them with a frozen half-smile that didn't match any human reflex. The moment the counterfeit Larson issued the order in Mason's voice, an instinct older than training hit every man in the squad, the primal certainty that something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. Mason raised a clenched fist, signaling freeze, but the creature posing as Larson mimicked the motion with perfect accuracy, Same angle, same timing, same micro-movements, like a reflection delayed by a fraction of a second. Daniels, trembling, whispered, "Sir, it's copying us. Learning us." The imposter's smile widened too far for human musculature, stretching unnaturally, as if the face were just a mask over something studying how to use it. Then slowly it stepped forward, but its boots didn't break the soil. It moved across the forest floor without leaving so much as a dent, sliding instead of walking. Peterson swallowed hard. Whatever that is, it's not bound to gravity. Mason raised his rifle and ordered, "Do not advance. Identify yourself." Larson, if it was still Larson at all, paused. Its head twitched, jerking slightly left, slightly right, as if testing multiple responses for authenticity. Then it chose one. "I am." 2 words, spoken in a voice that was unmistakably Mason's, not Larson's. Before Mason could react, the ground beneath them vibrated with a deep, resonant pulse, lower and heavier than the earlier signal. Trees trembled, not from wind but from synchronized movement, like hundreds of trunks subtly shifting in the same direction. Ruiz checked his radio pouch despite it being sealed. Even powered off, the radio throbbed faintly to the same rhythm. Daniels grabbed his shoulder. "It's not an interference pattern, it's a heartbeat." Slowly, impossibly, the entire valley seemed to inhale. The air tightened. Pressure expanded. The forest grew still, every leaf frozen in place. Then, behind the imposter Larson, a second figure stepped out from the trees. Same uniform, same height, same face, same blank, mimic expression. A perfect duplicate. Then a third. A fourth. They emerged without footsteps, without sound, filling the grid-patterned forest behind them like soldiers preparing for inspection. 12 figures, all identical, all wearing Larson's face. Peterson began hyperventilating. Hawthorne whispered prayers under his breath. The duplicates didn't blink, didn't shift weight, didn't even breathe. They simply watched, studied, mirrored subtle details of the squad's stance, almost as if their bodies were being calibrated. Mason realized the horrifying truth. They're replacing us in advance, copying before taking. He signaled retreat, using hand signs only an elite unit would understand. But the forest had anticipated it. As soon as they moved, the terrain shifted. Paths they had taken minutes ago no longer existed. Trees reoriented like silent guards closing ranks. And above the tree line, barely visible through the canopy, an enormous structure pulsed, a shape too large to comprehend, not built but grown into the sky. Its surface rippled like organic metal, absorbing light and radiating low-frequency waves. Peterson pointed upward, voice cracking. "Lieutenant, that thing wasn't here before." The valley answered his voice with a slow, tectonic groan. Hawthorne fired the first shot, not at the duplicates, but at the strange tower-like mass overhead. The bullet struck something, sparking briefly before dissolving into a haze of falling dust that drifted downward like ash. The duplicates reacted instantly, not with aggression but with imitation. Each one lifted its rifle in perfect synchronicity, mirroring Hawthorne's posture, so precisely it felt mechanical. But their weapons hadn't existed seconds earlier. They had grown from their arms, forming out of shadowed material that simply reshaped into rifles. Daniel screamed. "They're not copying gear, they're copying behavior." Shots rang out as Hawthorne, Peterson, and even Mason opened suppressive fire, but bullets passed through the duplicates' bodies without resistance, distorting them like reflections in disturbed water. The creatures advanced. Ruiz made the split-second decision to unseal the radio pouch and power the device, hoping to force an emergency beacon. As the radio booted, the forest reacted violently. The ground buckled, trees pitched at unnatural angles, and the massive structure overhead emitted a deafening pulse that sent every man crashing to the ground, clutching their ears. Within that pulse came a voice, not human, not digital, but somewhere in between. A layered chorus of every voice the valley had ever consumed. "Stay." One word, echoed 1,000 times. When the pulse stopped, 2 soldiers were gone, Hawthorne and Daniels, vanished silently between seconds. In their place stood 2 new duplicates, forming a second row behind the originals. Mason crawled toward Ruiz, shouting, "Send the beacon." Now. Ruiz slammed the emergency transmission key. The radio emitted a scream, an electronic howl, then overloaded, melting in his hands. Yet the beacon fired for exactly 1.7 seconds. Just long enough. High above the forest, beyond the canopy and unseen by the men below, the pulse reached a reconnaissance satellite. A single automated ping logged an anomaly at the coordinates of the valley. But by the time analysts checked it 14 hours later, the signal was gone, and so was the valley. Back on the ground, Mason and the remaining men attempted one final breakout toward the ridge, but every path led them back to the same clearing, again and again, as if the forest were folding space, herding them like cattle. The duplicates closed in, now mimicking even their breathing patterns with unnatural precision. Ruiz stumbled, reaching for Mason's vest. "Sir, we're already dead." Mason refused to accept it. He drew a flare, igniting it in a burst of red fire, and charged at the nearest duplicate. The flare passed through the figure's chest, releasing a burst of cold mist that extinguished the flame instantly. The duplicate tilted its head and copied Mason's expression: fear, defiance, despair, cycling through emotions as if trying them on. One by one, the men were taken. Not violently, not painfully, just erased. Mason was the last. As the duplicates closed around him, their faces shifted, becoming his. 12 identical Masons stared back at him, each head tilting in perfect unison. In his final recorded moment, captured on a partially corrupted bodycam file recovered years later by an unidentified analyst, Mason whispered, "Who are you?" All 12 replicas answered in chorus, "We are who you were." The footage ended there. When a follow-up team arrived 48 hours later, the valley no longer existed. The terrain had changed, hills shifted, trees rearranged, soil overturned, as if the land had been rewritten. No trace of the R-12 squad was ever found. Their files were sealed and reclassified under a code rarely used except in the highest clearance anomalies. The last note in the archive reads, "Do not return to Redline Gorge. It returns on its own."